We're very pleased to have James Purnell as our first speaker here today. James has got an amazingly rich and varied CV that provides him with a unique perspective on our theme of educating for the common good. He was a member of the last Labour government, serving first as Secretary of State for Culture and then Secretary of State for Work and Pensions. I got that right. Yeah. Upon leaving politics, James returned to the BBC, where he initially took up the role of Director of Strategy and then served as Director of Radio and Education between 2016 and 2020. In the latter role, he was responsible for the introduction of the BBC Sounds platform and also the BBC's education strategy. His last year at the BBC coincided with the start of the pandemic, and James oversaw the BBC's rush to provide educational support for children and parents struggling to grapple with home learning for the first time. James is now President and Vice Chancellor of the University of the Arts London. UAL recently launched their 2022-2032 strategy, The World Needs Creativity. The strategy is informed by the idea that a creative education should be available to all because creativity is what is needed to address the challenges facing the world. So there'll be time for some quick questions after James speaks, but now over to James.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Owen. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. I work on the other side of the field, so actually I can see this building every day from my office. So actually being inside is a joy, and it's a really beautiful space. So congratulations on that. I was working in education, as Owen said, at the BBC, but then obviously coming in the middle of the pandemic, it feels very much like this is one of the most important, interesting, challenging times for education policy since the Second World War. Some people may have read the work of Jonathan Grant, who used to work at an institution pretty close to here at King's, who calls this an in-between time. And what he means by that is a time when kind of the pieces have been shaken up, but they haven't really settled down into a new shape. And that's obviously challenging, but also a moment of real leverage. As we were just saying, we live at a moment when we're returning from the pandemic, when our students' lives were put on hold, indeed all of our staff and all of our lives were put on hold for many months and years. But it's also a moment when we can look back with pride, I think, at what we did, and a moment when the sector emerged, I think, more resilient even than before. I think also stepping back from the details, the pandemic proves something, in fact, two things we know to be true. First, that higher education serves an immense social purpose, and secondly, that we are at our best when we are conceiving of ourselves as a public service. So I want to talk a little bit about that today, what we're doing about it at UAL, and what it means for the sector as a whole, and I hope that's a good way of teeing up your interesting discussions today. So I joined UAL just over a year ago, and a couple of things struck me early on. The first is that universities are indispensable to our society. That may sound obvious, but it was proven very, very vividly during the pandemic, not least in the creation of vaccines, other medical approaches, other social policy interventions, which we should never forget. And they saved millions of lives in Britain and even more around the world. Universities remain integral to Britain's future, educating the next generation, creating the next set of industries, but also thinking more generally about the big problems that we face as a country and as a world. We showed adaptability, I think, during the pandemic, and I think that has been vindicated by the fact that more students have applied to come to university this year than at any time in our history. So on the one hand, we're indispensable, the number of people wanting to come is growing. On the other hand, coming into a new sector, you are struck by how underappreciated people feel. Now, I have some maybe comforting news from the BBC, which is that's also what people feel like at the BBC. So there's maybe some common threads to explore there, but it's certainly true that I think we feel look at all this amazing stuff we did in the pandemic, look at all this incredible potential we have to change the world. And on the other hand, I think a lot of the surface narrative about universities feeling pretty critical, and certainly more critical than it would have been 10 or 20 years ago. So universities are held to blame for much that's wrong in our society, a growing divide between young and old, between metropolitan cities and left behind towns, between knowledge workers and care workers. And some of our politicians also seem to blame us for woke politics. Now, I'm 52 years old, and it's probably too late for me to become a left-wing radical. But of course, as someone who went to university in the 1980s, I remember the innocent prelapsarian days of student politics when all we would do would be to put up pin-ups of Tory ministers on our walls and celebrate how wonderful the policies of the Tory government were at the time. But in all seriousness, university bashing does have consequences. The effect of inflation on the unit resource for universities will have meant a reduction from £9,000 when the new cap was introduced in 2012 to by 2024, in real terms, it will be worth 6,600. So this isn't something we can step aside from. One of the interesting things coming into the sector again is how much of our destiny is in our hands. So I think there's an interesting conversation about how much we worry about government policy, but certainly on the unit of resource, on the fee that students pay, I think that's something that we're going to have to keep on arguing about and trying to change the climate of opinion around HE. And to do that, I think we have to recognise that social contract, that trust has slightly frayed, and we need to go back to first principles to try and rebuild it. And to me, that means starting from your theme today, which is educating for the common good, or as we describe it at UAL, social purpose. So to do that, I think we need to go back to the beginning of that thread, as I said. We as a university are absolute babies compared to LSE. We were founded less than 2 decades ago in 2003. Our roots, though, very similarly to yours, go back to the 19th century. We were a set of art colleges, fashion schools, all over London. We kind of had a combination of the West End artists and the East End workers. But I very much like the formulation of LSE's original cause, was it the understanding the causes for the betterment of society. Our mission is to change the world through our knowledge and our creativity. That's always been the case. If you go back to all of our founding institutions, Camberwell College's purpose, for example, was to educate all classes in the district. And though much has changed since the 19th century, we continue to be true to that purpose. Now, LSE, of course, was founded by the Webbs, George Bernard Shaw, with a very similar commitment to making a difference through research. And so it's an interesting moment at which to compare our different perspectives. So what do we mean by social purpose? I mean, it's one of those terms that's become so fashionable, it's almost lost its meaning. You know, when you have Larry Fink, who is the chief executive, I think, of one of the biggest investment fund managers in the world, talking about basing his business on social purpose, you can see that the term has become quite capacious. And if anyone was following Davos recently, there was a backlash against kind of woke capitalism, as they called it. I think there may be a debate about it in business, but for us as a sector, there's no debate. Our purpose is to make a difference through the things that we do, whether that's our teaching or our research, or as I'll try to argue later on through wanting to make some changes in society. Universities are here for a social purpose, and that's simply what we do. We're not businesses. We're here to change the world through the students and the ideas that we send out into the world. So our future, our collective future, and that social contract depends on not only how we live up to that social purpose, but how I think we breathe new life into it. So as I said, when I started this job, I very much enjoyed reading Jonathan Grant's work. He actually published his book, The New Power University, in the month that I started. And in it, he, I think, eloquently makes the case for a new kind of sector. It's probably not too strong to use those words, one that is not focused on profit or maximizing income, but one that is founded on social purpose. And the in-between time that he speaks about, it wasn't just about the disruption from the pandemic. It was about how the pandemic forced the sector to abandon old thinking and to embrace new models and ideas. And I very much agree that there is a danger of snapping back into a pre-COVID world, which would be a very strange thing for any sector of the economy to do. And it does feel strange to be being encouraged by the government to forget everything that was learned during the pandemic, when actually, if you look across the whole of the economy, sectors are being transformed by technology, for good, for ill, for new ways of working, for good, for ill. And in my view, one always has to look at those forces and try and shape them for good and try and minimize the downsides. And that would feel like a more positive narrative. Let me say a bit about what that means for UAL. For anyone who doesn't know, UAL is ranked number 2 in the world. The RCA is the number 1. We're the biggest creative university in the world. We are where Alexander McQueen and Steve McQueen studied, Phoebe Philo, Stella McCartney. It's where John Berger found new ways of seeing. It's where Gilbert met George. It's where Jarvis Cocker met a girl from Greece with a thirst for knowledge. You can probably guess where she studied. So as I say, we've been around for just over 100 years, but we've only become a university in the last 20 years. And coming in, it feels like I have a real opportunity to build on a very successful last few years and to try and take it to the next level by going back to what that social purpose means and trying to define ourselves around it and design the university around it. And that's what we set out in the strategy that you mentioned, Owen. Obviously I work with universities in government, but actually coming into the sector, one of the things which I hadn't quite understood is how small our institutions are. I mean, it's most stark in America, where if you took all of the Ivy League students, you could fit them into one American football stadium in one of the biggest universities in America. I think it's about 130,000 people. It's a tiny bit less stark here, but again, Oxford and Cambridge are 20,000. I think you're half of that. We're about 20,000. So we're all turning away thousands of students every year who actually could flourish in our institutions. And certainly we at UAL don't want to be defined by that kind of exclusivity. We want to be defined by our inclusivity. And the kind of fundamental idea in our strategy is how can we extend the benefits of a UAL education to anyone who could benefit from being with us. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that we'll just have open access to all of our BAs and MAs, but it does mean challenging ourselves to think, how can we use our platform, how can we use online, how can we use access to create kind of a pyramid of access so that there is something which people can take up if they're interested in creativity and which we can provide for them. So how are we doing that in our strategy? Well, we want to grow. So over the next 10 years, we're aiming to double the number of students at UAL. It's a bit less in full-time equivalent numbers, and because, as I'll say in a second, a lot of that growth is in non-residential, traditional undergrad, postgrad degrees, actually what the definition of full-time is starts to become pretty baggy. But yeah, the overall goal is to double the number of students. We want to do that both online and in person. Over the last few years, we've been in a program of significantly investing in our teaching and learning, but we will continue to do that. And so the goal, and I won't pretend this is easy to do in practice, but the goal is both to raise quality even further, address the feedback we get on student experience, but grow quite significantly at the same time. We're aiming to add about 5,000 residential places and 10,000 online. It's a strategy for quality at scale. We want to lead the world in terms of creative education, but we also want to lead the world in terms of access. And so we're thinking very hard about how we can use our recruitment and our finances to try and make sure that we can reduce the financial barriers coming to UAL. More scholarships, but much more thinking to be done on that as well. And we're going to have quite a proactive role in arguing for reforms to the student finance system to reduce the barriers to people studying in London and to try and bring back grants. So that's a very quick rush through our strategy. If you want more detail, it's available online. But it's not just about having our strategy. We'd also like to be part of a movement both within the sector and beyond to define the world around social purpose, for us all to agree that's essentially why we go to work in whatever we do, whether we're Larry Fink or whether we're working with HE. So we're doing a bit of work on a framework for social purpose, and if people do want to define their institutions around it, how they can do that in practical terms. So we'll publish that in the autumn. But just as a tiny bit of a sort of aperitif, I'll tell you some things that we've been thinking about, and three in particular, and it'd be interesting to discuss some of those in Q&A. First of all, I think defining yourself around social purpose means you have to be authentic to that, and those goals have to be primary. And that means in particular that sometimes you have to make, where there's a sort of trade-off between finances and social purpose, you have to privilege social purpose. So a good example of that would be the living wage. I think in the HE sector, 38 universities are living wage accredited employers. I think that means that over 100 aren't. So I think we'd encourage everybody to be accredited. I think the LSE used to be, but isn't anymore. Maybe was my research this morning, but someone here may know better than me. We just renegotiated our contract, and we're not just sticking at that. We've also increased the number of days of holiday entitlement from 22 to 31, and we're piloting something called living hours, which is basically getting rid of 0 hours contracts and giving people 4 weeks notice of changes to their rota. And that's based on the insight that if you're poorly paid in work poverty, people typically have family responsibilities. If your rota can change at a few hours notice, that can be extremely disruptive for any family. So we will guarantee 15 hours of minimum for everybody who works on those contracts, and a minimum of 4 weeks notice before their rota is changed. So we're going to pilot that, and then based on the pilot we will roll it out. And I suppose I say all of that to say clearly there's a financial cost to that, but when there's a choice there, I think if you are going to brand yourself as and define yourself around social purpose, you then have to take those costs on the chin. The second thing we've learned over the last years, you have to plan to deliver your social purpose goals. You can't just say that you're in favour of social purpose. And I think there's an interesting point here, and again, Jonathan Grant talks about this, about the tension between academic freedom and organisational impact. And I'm sure there'll be people here more expert than me on this, but he starts from the Calvin Doctrine, which he describes as universities should not take positions on political or social issues because this will chill debate within their own institutions. And be interesting to know what the LSE perspective is on that. I mean, Jonathan very much argues that not taking a position is taking a position, and I agree with him. And so we are very much committed to developing areas where we will take a position and try and achieve change. An area where we do that already, for example, is fashion sustainability. Fashion is responsible for 4% of global emissions. So we're clearly not neutral about that at UAL. Having said that, having a position doesn't mean that you have a position on every issue of the day, nor that you support a political party. So what we are working on is a process for defining which positions, which issues we take a position on, and our two kind of core conditions are, one, that we should have an expertise in it, and secondly, that we as an institution should have debated whether we're going to take a position on it and decided it together. However, once we've done that, we're not neutral about the outcome. We do want to organise ourselves and work with others to make those ideas manifest and bring about certain outcomes in society. And then the third thing is you have to make yourself accountable. You have to set some goals and you have to track whether you deliver on them. And we've just recently appointed Polly Mackenzie, who's the just stopped being the chief executive at Demos to run this area for us, and this is going to be one of the areas that she will look at. But to give you some examples, last year we committed to 30% of our staff being people of colour within 3 years. We're ahead of target on delivering that one. We've eliminated our gender pay gap and are rapidly reducing our ethnicity pay gap, which is down to 7.4% from 12% last year. We've made some progress on reducing our awarding gap, although we have further to go. And as maybe just as a final point, there's always a danger when you're making yourself accountable that you focus on the things that you can measure. Social purpose is harder to measure, but we will find ways of making ourselves accountable. And it may just be saying, here's 3 things we want to make a difference on, and we will have a candid conversation every year about what progress we've made or haven't. So I hope that's a helpful trot around what we're doing, what we think the sector should be thinking about. We're a hugely long way from where we want to end up. We still got all sorts of problems, all sorts of debates. You know, we decided to keep on outsourcing our cleaning and security contract. That remains controversial at UAL. I don't know if your strike has stopped here, but ours is still going on. As I say, our awarding gap is 6% less than it was last year, but it's still 11%. So we haven't got all the answers. We've got hugely further to go. But I do think that aiming for social purpose or the common good is the first step. It sets the standard you have to judge yourself by, it galvanises the institution. And so I'm delighted to see you here holding this symposium today and wish you the very best of luck with it. Thank you very much.
So we're going to take questions for James. I just need to try and sort out the camera before we do that. So if you all want to think very deeply about your questions and ignore me. I think the problem is this, basically.
If people couldn't hear my speech, David, we can maybe put it in the chat.
No, they could hear you. They couldn't see you. Sorry, I know you put your makeup on this morning, but... that's what you see now. Why? Because I left the meeting. It's not picking up the camera, though. There we go. Okay. All right. Good. Right. We're fine. Okay. Sorry. So, did anyone have a question for James? I know I have a burning one I want to ask. Yeah.
Hi. Thanks very much. I thought it was really interesting and lots to think about. I was interested in this idea that you started off with about changing the world through the students and ideas that we send into the world. But I can see also some tensions between that ambition and the reality that if we're changing and if we're becoming more flexible, then we actually, we have to do some of that work online. But change is more difficult online because there is, in my experience anyway, something very special about the alchemy that happens in a classroom when everybody is together in person. At the same time, if you then argue that change is more powerful when you bring people in and we have to make it easier for people to come, then you're also then still privileging the institution and saying that being here is the most important thing. And in any other kind of industry, you would say, from the comms perspective anyway, which is where I work, you would say you take the communication to them, you take the things to them into their lives and you integrate with them rather than prioritising yourself. So there's kind of tensions there around how we realise this ambition of changing the world while also decentering ourselves, which I think is really important. I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yes, it's a fantastic question, and I don't think we know yet. I think the music industry is quite an interesting analogy in that an awful lot has gone online. Spotify, Apple Music, etc., have, I think, significantly improved the experience of one type of consumption of music, but the live experience is actually where the artists make all their money. So I think from our point of view as a sector, avoiding what happened in music, which is essentially someone else did it, and they now control the access to the listener in that case. In our case, it would be the learner. That's a really good warning. But also not think it's going to be the same everywhere. Yeah, it may be that different types of learners are better served in person and online. It could well be, when we look back on this, that the kind of undergrad, certainly undergraduate experience remains very much in person, blended learning and all the things that we know, but essentially people going to a place to study, whereas professional development or lifelong learning end up being more easily done online. I think certainly with the government's lifelong learning entitlement idea, which I think is a good one, I can't see how they deliver that without a very strong online component. But if you look at somewhere like Arizona State, for example, in America, you're very interested on that. They've gone from having, I think, 25,000 students in 2003, all of them in person, to now 75,000 in person and 100,000 online. And that appears to be, from what I've seen, for both undergrad, postgrad courses and for more professional development. They've got a big contract with Starbucks, for example, where they are the way that Starbucks can say to employees, we will always give you a development offer. But they also seem to have found a way of getting lots of people to do their more traditional courses, but in online mode. So that's a different market. They don't have the Open University there and all those things. So yeah, I guess that's a long-winded way of saying we don't know yet, but we should go into it with an open mind, and we should certainly be trying to take the benefits of new technology for our students and our institutions rather than letting someone else come in and do it to us. Don't know if that answers.
Anyone else? Any other questions? Lydia?
Hi, thank you. That was a really interesting presentation. I work in student partnership at LSE, and something that we often see is just how motivated students are to make things better, whether that's internally in the university or externally, whether it's through research, campaigning, things like that. And I was just wondering what role students might have had in developing the framework that you mentioned, or what role they might have in kind of shaping the social purpose going forwards.
Great question, thank you. So we based the strategy on, it was kind of an internal process, but staff focus groups and student focus groups. The big message that came through from students was, yes, social purpose, but also employability. And they really didn't see it as a choice. I imagine it's very similar for lots of your courses, but if you come into fashion these days, you are totally focused on climate, anti-racism, changing the industry that you're going into, but you also want to be successful and get a job or set up your label or whatever. So those, I think the big point that came to them from us was, we want a good career out of this, but that career is going to be about social purpose and change. As we start to deliver this, we want to do it in partnership with our students, both with the union and more widely. I think I heard someone talk about change makers here, but we have a really great change makers program which we're using, for example, to put climate into every single one of our subjects over the next couple of years. So yeah, this is the start of it for us, I think, trying to co-create it with students, but that's going to be a big part of the theme.
Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry.
Hi there, James. Thanks very much for the presentation. It's Ken Lee here, part of the faculty here at the university. I was interested whether there was any pushback within the university, because it's quite interesting. At the start, you talk about that slight tension between elitism and a direct tension between that and perhaps educating for the common good. You actually referred to your ranking right at the start, quite rightly, proudly talking about that global ranking. And I guess you could make decisions following this mission of where you put your money. Okay, some amount of investment could maintain, enhance that ranking, and you might be diverting it for what many of us would agree would be a better purpose. But was there any pushback within the institution? Is it an ongoing negotiation in reality?
Discussion, negotiation, yeah, all of those things. Yes, I think the biggest fear is about bad growth. So either growth which isn't based on the social purpose, so you just have a vice chancellor who just wants a bigger institution with more students and more kind of glory or whatever. So trying to show that we're absolutely rooting it in social purpose goals has been one thing. We have grown through over recruitment in the past, so we've grown quite quickly, but we haven't really planned for it in advance. So we're doing a lot of work on, and this isn't about taking every course that's got excess demand and doubling the size of the course. What we're trying to do is to find courses and subjects which are adjacent to what we're doing and grow into those. And then there are some courses they want to grow, and so supporting them to do that. And so there's quite a lot of nitty-gritty of saying, well, how can we guarantee funding for colleges for the next 3 years so that they are confident to invest up to the forecast numbers of students? Because what's happened in the past is A, we didn't plan for it, and B, so the numbers didn't really materialise until the autumn, and B, the colleges were worried that if the numbers didn't come up, they'd have to make cuts, and obviously that's harder than. So we'd scramble around in November for more highly paid lecturers, and our buildings would be the size they were. So I think the biggest question amongst my colleagues at staff would be, is this going to be more of the same? Are we going to have more growth, squeezing more people in, and we have some student experience challenges, definitely. So how we manage to address those in the next couple of years, so that by the time that the growth starts to take off towards the end of this 3-year period, we're bringing people into something that we're confident about. And I'm sure this is very similar to your institution. There's lots of pushback and questions about all sorts of aspects of it, but that's the core one, I think.
Okay, thank you. I think we might have maybe one more question, or do you need to go, James? Claire, did you have a question?
Well, I mean, first of all, fantastic presentation, very inspiring. And yes, we do have debates here about whether we should take a position or not. And on the whole, we don't take positions, which not everybody in the institution agrees with. So on that, I mean, it really slightly follows on from Lydia's question. You spoke about we a lot. We are. But I want to know is who are the we when you're trying to decide, what, for example, when will we take a position? Who are the we making that decision?
Yes, that's a brilliant question, and we don't have a complete answer to it yet. Partly because Polly hasn't arrived yet, so she arrives in July. I mean, the we can be obviously a research centre or an individual academic or students and academics. So, we have a Design Against Crime research centre. Now, obviously, they take a position on designing against crime, and they have some views about rehabilitation or those things. When I'm talking about we, I mean as a university. So I think we need to we're working with London citizens, the community organisers, so we'll do a great big listening exercise, and both internal and external, but I would imagine at the end of that we'll have single figure issues which we as a university would have taken a view on. We will satisfy ourselves that there are issues that matter, that we have a particular expertise, and we need to have some kind of process so that if people think we as a university shouldn't be taking a position on it, we can think about those things. And I mean, in the end, it will be the executive board, the academic board, and the court, I think. And at the UAL, the executive board is probably the preeminent of those two, but the academic board would have an input as well.
Okay, I think that's probably all the time we have today for James. So just everyone, give a round of applause again.